Thank you, Mr. President, for chairing today's important meeting, and thank you to our briefers, both of whom have been personally targeted for assassination, both of whom have been tortured at the hands of this brutal regime. Thank you for your courage, thank you for your strength, and for coming today to speak on behalf of the Iranian people. Colleagues, let me be clear. The level of violence, the level of repression that the Iranian regime has unleashed on its own citizens, its own people, has repercussions for international peace and security. You're going to hear today that it doesn't, that it's an internal matter. Absolutely wrong and false. This demands this council's attention. The people of Iran are demanding their freedom like never before in the Islamic Republic's brutal history. Unarmed, peaceful people who love their country are taking to the streets in pursuit of their legitimate aspirations for a better future. Well, this is our message. President Donald J. Trump and the United States of America stands by the brave people of Iran, period. And regardless of its excuses, and you will hear many today from the Iranian regime and from its friends, the regime is solely responsible for the economic misery of the Iranian people and the repression of their freedom, and they will be held accountable. The estimates of the numbers of protesters killed by the regime so far range from the thousands to the tens of thousands. Although visibility into the totality of the violence has been obscured deliberately by the regime's nationwide internet blackout. Why has the internet been shut down for weeks? Why have the phone lines been cut? Why are commercial satellite communications being jammed in a very sophisticated manner? We've had a complete blackout. No internet, no phones, nothing. Only thanks to the Starlink system do we even have some window, a limited window, into the atrocities that are ongoing. Well, President Trump has been clear. He will not, nor should the international community, tolerate innocents being slaughtered in the streets. Since 1979, for decades, the regime has posed a threat to peace and security in the name of a religious ideology. The regime calls for death to America and the annihilation of Israel. Even as its own citizens cannot afford the very basics, food, drinking water, very basic medicines, it spends billions to develop its nuclear and ballistic missile programs to threaten its neighbors in the world and its support of terrorism. Well, from its inception, the regime has been the world's #1 state sponsor of terrorism, so declared year after year, bringing uncountable death and suffering to innocents from Beirut all the way to Buenos Aires, while its rulers have become rich off of oppression and misery meted upon the Iranian people. The Iranian regime has also been a serial human rights abuser from its very first day in power. And as you heard today, young women like Mahsa Amini have been murdered for daring to uncover their hair in public. While religious minorities have been subjected to the most severe persecution, these abuses have been documented right here by this body, have been documented at length by the United Nations, have been documented by the Secretary General's own regular reports on the situation of human rights in Iran, the most recent of which was released just last year in 2025. Colleagues, in addition to the gross human rights abuses In addition to its illegal march towards a nuclear weapon, in 1979, the regime we now know, led by Ayatollah Khamenei, gave support to radical students who attacked the United States Embassy in Tehran, took over 50 Americans hostage, and held them in captivity for over 400 days. That was followed by the bombing attack on the United States Embassy in Beirut, killing 17 Americans and scores of Lebanese civilians, followed by the supported and direction of terrorists who drove 2 trucks filled with explosives into U.S. and French barracks in Beirut, killing 241 American soldiers and 58 French military personnel, all part of a multinational force invited by the Lebanese government. It's responsible for the deaths of over 600 American service members and countless others in Iraq. Bottom line is Iran's partners and proxies with Iranian weaponry, documented by the United Nations Yemen panel of experts, have repeatedly attacked our partners in the Gulf and attempted to damage global energy infrastructure. And then finally, the Iranian regime state television amplifies calls for a, quote, one-bomb solution to wipe Israel off the map, which ironically would be not only a massacre of all Israelis, but also the Palestinian people whom the regime claims to support. In 2011, the regime attempted to assassinate the Saudi ambassador to the United States in Washington, D.C., but luckily the attempt was thwarted, and further, the regime has continued to plot assassination attempts against the President of the United States, against President Trump, and other senior U.S. government officials, in addition to those who dare speak out living here in the United States. Colleagues, Iran has destabilized the Middle East for decades. It has supported and enabled Hamas's brutality, its hostage-taking, its heinous October 7th attacks. It has funded Hezbollah. It has funded the Houthis, Iranian-aligned militia groups in Iraq, including Kataib Hezbollah, have attacked the United States and the region again and again. It's backed the brutal Assad regime, and at every turn, the regime has put terrorist proxies in other nations before the welfare of its own citizens. And as a result of the regime's actions, putting money in the pockets of terrorists, funding its nuclear and missile programs instead of the basic needs for the people of Iran, Iranians have had enough. The regime's dereliction of duty to its own citizens is what has put the Ayatollahs in the positions they are in today, with hundreds of thousands, if not millions, protesting in the streets after decades of neglect and abuse. So everyone should ask themselves, everyone sitting here today, how many people are dead? How many people are wounded, maimed, and abused in the Middle East, in Israel, in Gaza, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen, Iraq, even Venezuela, because of the regime's support for terrorism as the largest state sponsor? And I would like to address the allegation put forward by the regime that these inspired protests are somehow a foreign plot to give a precursor to military action. Everyone in the world needs to know that the regime is weaker than ever before, and therefore is putting forward this lie because of the power of the Iranian people in the streets. They are afraid. They're afraid of their own people. Iran says it's ready for dialogue, but its actions say otherwise. This is a regime that rules through oppression, through violence, and through intimidation, and has destabilized the Middle East for decades. Well, enough is enough. We all have a responsibility to support the Iranian people and to put an end to the regime's neglect and oppression of the Iranian nation. Colleagues, let me be clear. President Trump is a man of action, not endless talk like we see at the United Nations. He has made it clear all options are on the table to stop the slaughter. And no one should know that better than the leadership of the Iranian regime. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President, since the end of December, the whole world has been watching as the United States continues to escalate tensions and fuel hysteria around Iran, declaring that help is already on the way. What's more, in its official statements, Washington has not even tried to cover up the genuine reasons for its alleged concern over the country's internal political situation as it threatens new strikes against Iran. Today's meeting, convened by our American colleagues, is nothing more than yet another attempt to justify blatant aggression and interference in the internal affairs of a sovereign state. And if, as Washington puts it, Iran's authorities do not come to their senses, then Washington will solve the Iranian problem in its favorite way through strikes aimed at overthrowing an undesirable regime. To lend credibility to their actions and to justify them, they have invited today's briefers, individuals who have been living in the United States for some 20 years and promoting an anti-Iranian agenda in Washington's interests. These so-called briefers cannot speak on behalf of the Iranian people. We firmly reject any attempts by the U.S. to waste Council members' valuable time on briefings that are meant only to serve the interests and the position of those who convened this meeting, and briefings that are in no way related to issues of international peace and security. What just took place overall was nothing more than a circus, an embarrassment, a cheap show that is unbefitting of members of the Council. Mr. President, we have carefully studied the letters circulated in the Security Council in recent days from the Iranian mission. We express our solidarity with the people of Iran and mourn all innocent victims. We see that hostile external forces are attempting to exploit the current situation in order to overthrow a government they find objectionable and destroy the Islamic Republic of Iran as a sovereign and independent state. At the same time, we note that the authorities in Tehran have declared and reaffirmed their commitment to their international obligations, including respect for human rights and ensuring conditions for the peaceful expression of public opinion, while at the same time fulfilling their inherent duty to protect citizens' lives, public order, and the country's territorial integrity. As far as we can tell, the protest momentum has begun to subside and the situation is gradually normalizing. The government of Iran has taken the necessary steps to stabilize the economic situation and has established a constructive dialogue with the public in order to address any emerging issues. Mass rallies have taken place in the Islamic Republic of Iran in support of the country's supreme leader and its independent course. The Russian Federation is convinced that today's meeting of the Council should be approached through the lens of its mandate to maintain international peace and security and uphold international law, and not through the lens of Iran's internal political affairs. Violations of the aforementioned norms and principles in the current situation are obvious. They include the extremely dangerous and irresponsible rhetoric employed in recent days by U.S. leadership, which has gone as far as openly calling for the takeover of state institutions in Iran and threats to assist the protesters. Such statements amount to nothing other than incitement to violently overthrow the constitutional order of a sovereign state. They are a gross violation of paragraphs 4 and 7 of Article 2 of the UN Charter, which prohibit the threat or use of force and establish the principle of non-interference in the domestic affairs of states. Mr. President, what is happening on the streets of Iran in recent days has gone far beyond peaceful protest. There have been documented cases of firearms use, killings of law enforcement officers as well as civilians, arson attacks on medical facilities and public institutions, as well as attacks on emergency service facilities. These actions cannot be covered up by the pretext of freedom of expression or protecting human rights. What is happening in Iran is yet another example of the use of tried and tested methods for a color revolution in which specially trained armed provocateurs transform peaceful protests into senseless violence, riots, destruction of public property, and brutal killings of police officers, state security personnel, and peaceful protesters, including children. As we have already seen repeatedly in a number of states, all these actions are either directed or supported by external forces that are interested in a so-called regime change. In the present situation, these external forces are not even bothering to conceal their involvement in violent actions, especially given that the President of the United States has openly called on protesters to take over Iranian state institutions. The U.S. and its cheerleaders are actively exploiting the economic and social difficulties faced by ordinary Iranians, difficulties caused by unlawful sanctions pressure imposed on Iran by Western states. They're using this to inflame public tensions and destabilize the domestic political situation. The current situation is clearly in line with Washington's declared policy, one supported by its allies, of maximum pressure on Tehran in order to advance their own political interests in the Middle East. They are using every means available to achieve this. And this includes not only unlawful unilateral sanctions imposed in circumvention of the Security Council and in blatant violation of the UN Charter, but also unceremonious blackmail of other states by increases in trade tariffs. Our Western colleagues are not above using the Security Council as a tool to promote their delusional agenda. A striking example of this is the attempt by the UK, France, and Germany to create the illusion of reinstating anti-Iranian Security Council resolutions through the purported triggering of the snapback mechanism envisioned in Resolution 2231 of the Security Council. Their justification for this relied on Western states' fabrications about some sort of threat to international peace and security posed by Iran's peaceful nuclear program. And this is despite the fact that the IAEA Director General has never reached such conclusions in his reports on the matter, nor found evidence of diversion of nuclear material to military purposes. And the entire crisis surrounding the implementation of the JCPOA was provoked by Washington's unilateral withdrawal from the nuclear deal in 2018. Nevertheless, the EU3 continues to promote its baseless narrative and deepen divisions within the Security Council. What is most concerning is Washington's aggressive course towards the use of military force and threats of its use against Iran. We condemn such actions, no matter what arguments are used to justify them, as a gross violation of international law and the UN Charter. We strongly urge the hotheads in Washington and other capitals who seem to be contemplating a repeat military venture to come to their senses and avoid a repetition of the tragedy of June 2025, when U.S.-Israeli aggression nearly resulted in a major nuclear catastrophe with inevitable humanitarian and environmental consequences. We demand that the United States and its like-minded partners refrain from further reckless steps, including those involving nuclear facilities. They should rather focus on providing solid assurances against further confrontation and resume joint efforts to find potential solutions. This includes addressing unfounded concerns regarding Iran's peaceful nuclear program. All of this should be done on the basis of international law and seeking a balance of all stakeholders' interests. Our country stands ready to assist this in every possible way. Mr. President, the Russian Federation decisively condemns all forms of external interference, incitement to violence, and threats of use of force against the friendly nation of Iran. We call on the conveners of today's meeting to stop making themselves out to be a global judge and put an end to their escalatory actions. Your actions risk plunging the region into even bloodier chaos that could easily spill beyond its borders. And a separate appeal to our colleagues on the Council and all UN member states. We call on them to prevent a new large-scale escalation and ensure that the Security Council is not used to justify unlawful regime change scenarios or to name and shame the legitimate authorities of a sovereign state. Thank you.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. Mr. President, let me state from the outset our firm objection to the participation of the so-called representatives of civil society. I must be absolutely clear. Both briefers imposed by the representative of the United States regime under this false label do not represent Iran's civil society. They represent the political agenda of the United States and Israeli regimes. They have lived outside Iran for more than 2 decades and have consistently engaged in incitement to violence and promotion of extremist and terrorist activities, including advocating and facilitating the use of lethal force against law enforcement officers. Their presence here is therefore neither legitimate nor credible, and it fundamentally undermines the integrity of this discussion. It is shameful that the United States regime transferred this esteemed body to a scene for theater and show, for baseless accusation and statement. This is in line with the United States regime in dismantling and disgracing the United Nations system. If you want to look for a case, the killing of innocent lady in Minnesota last week and nationwide crackdown can be brought here with the testimony and with the briefers. And please teach them the meaning of briefing. The briefing is different from the personal statement and accusation. Please do not sell them to the world as representatives of Iran's civil society. Their acts and statements regarding Iran are far from civil, and they have long divorced from Iran's society. They amplify the Israeli-American foreign agenda. They are both on Mossad's payroll, in accordance with undeniable evidence. We have taken note of the briefing provided by ASG. Regrettably, her briefing was one-sided and not grounded in factual evidence. Mr. President, I wish to extend my deepest condolences and sympathy with a heavy and grieving heart to the brave people of my country and to the families of many victims. In recent weeks, Iran has lost numerous innocent civilians and devoted members of its security and law enforcement forces. Many of our young people were brutally murdered in acts of extreme violence resulting from the atrocities committed by ISIS. Many of our police officers sacrificed their lives in the line of duty to protect civilians and preserve public order. I speak today on behalf of a nation in mourning. It is deeply regrettable that the representative of the United States regime who requested this meeting has today resorted to lies, distortion of facts, and deliberate misinformation to conceal his country's direct involvement in steering unrest in Iran to violence. In fact, the United States request for this meeting is shameful. To conceal their direct complicity in the crime their mercenaries have committed against our nations from 8 to 10 January. As part of Israel's malicious attempt to drag America into another war of aggression against Iran. Under the hollow pretext of concern for the Iranian people and claims of support for human rights, the United States regime is attempting to portray itself as a friend of the Iranian people, while simultaneously laying the groundwork for political destabilization and military intervention under a so-called humanitarian narrative. These claims are particularly cynical when viewed against the United States regime long and well-documented record of unlawful military interventions, regime change operations, and systematic violations of international law and the Charter of the United Nations. Across the world, these policies have led to mass civilian casualties, the collapse of states, prolonged humanitarian disasters, and the emergence and empowerment of extremist and terrorist groups. This is not a matter of opinion. It is a matter of historical record and fact. The Iranian people for decades have experienced the true meaning of the so-called support. The United States pattern of coercion and interference under the deceptive pretext is clear, from the orchestration of the 1956 coup against the democratically elected government of Dr. Mossadegh to its extensive political, military, and intelligence backing of Saddam's regime war of aggression against Iran. From the downing of Iran Air Flight 655 in 1988, killing 290 innocent civilians, to its complicity in assassinations, sabotage, and attacks against Iranian civilian and infrastructure, including the war of aggression carried out in June 2025, and from decades of unlawful unilateral sanctions to systematic economic coercion. These measures have gravely violated the Iranian people's fundamental rights, including their inherent rights of life, health, and development. Unfortunately, several Western members of this Council, including France and United Kingdom regimes, have once again adopted their familiar double standards, while claiming to champion human rights and to support the Iranian people. They have, alongside the United States regime, imposed some of the most and unlawful sanctions in modern history. Sanctions that have inflicted widespread sanctions in modern history. Sanctions that have inflicted widespread suffering on civilians. At the same time, they have failed to condemn, let alone sanction, the Israeli regime for its acts of genocide and crimes against humanity. Mr. President, between 8 and 10 January 26, the people and government of the Islamic Republic of Iran were confronted with ISIS-style acts of terrorism and extreme violence across the country. Peaceful protests that began on 28 December 2025 with legitimate economic demands were deliberately hijacked by organized armed groups and transformed into violent riots. Documented cases include beheading, people being burned alive, police officers and ordinary citizens beaten to death, widespread use of firearms, and the deliberate torching of ambulances, fire engines, health facilities, residential buildings, and places of worship. These were not isolated incidents. They reflect a clear and systematic pattern of organized violence. A significant number of police officers were killed or severely injured. These heavy casualties demonstrate the extreme brutality of terrorist elements. The situation is, in fact, very simple. The United States regime and its accomplices, particularly the Israeli regime, cannot evade responsibility for the innocent blood that has been shed in my country. Unable to achieve their objectives through the 12-day war of aggression against Iran in June 2025, they have now sought to pursue the same goals through political destabilization, internal unrest, and chaos. This strategy relies on manufacturing casualties, spreading false and inflated figures, and creating a pretext for foreign intervention. It is a familiar script, one that has been used repeatedly from Iraq to Libya and to Venezuela. Mr. President, allow me to recall only a few of interventionist and reckless statements made by U.S. officials, which clearly demonstrates Washington's direct involvement in this unrest. On 29 December 2025, during a joint press conference with the Prime Minister of Israel regime, the President of the United States regime declared, if Iran continues with its missile program, yes, I support a strike. If they continue with their nuclear program, the strike should be immediate. He further threatened, we are going to have to knock them down. We'll knock them down. We'll knock the hell out of them. On 2nd January, former U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo openly acknowledged the presence of Mossad agents among the rioters. I quote the same wording he used in his message in X. Happy New Year to every Iranian in the street, also to every Mossad agent beside them. End of the quote. On 3rd January 2026, the President of the United States regime stated, we are locked and loaded and ready to go. On 10 January 2026, Senator Lindsey Graham publicly incited violence action, stating when President Trump says, make Iran great again, it means protesters in Iran should defeat the Ayatollah. On 12 January, the White House spokesperson confirmed that President Trump would not be hesitant to use military force against Iran. On the same day, Senator Graham declared, I quote, Iran's leadership must be destroyed. This is the best opportunity since 1779 to change the Middle East. On 13 January, the US President stated, and I quote, "Iranian patriots, keep protesting. Take over your institutions. Help is on its way." And the statement of the representative of the United States regime today will be added to this list. These are not isolated remarks. They constitute explicit calls for regime change, violence, and military aggression. Mr. President, the exploitation of peaceful protest for geopolitical purposes and reckless endangerment of civilian lives fully aligned with the destructive role and unlawful unilateral sanctions have played in creating this situation. Claims of concern for human rights ring hollow when made by those who systematically violated them. 3 days ago, millions of Iranians marched to restore calm in our cities, to support law and order, and to reject reckless attempts to push our country towards civilian conflicts. President Trump chose to ignore this historic display of unity and restraint. Instead, he issued a provocative statement aimed at reinvigorating unrest. But people of Iran, nationwide, ignored his invitation for further violence, and this is why calm has been reestablished across the country. Mr. President, any threat to use of force against the Islamic Republic of Iran under any pretext, including claims of protecting protesters or supporting the Iranian people, constitute a grave and manifest violation of international law and the UN Charter. Such unlawful actions directly breach Article 2.4, which prohibits the threat or use of force, and Article 2.7, which enshrines the principle of non-intervention. No rule of doctrine, narrative, or political justification can legitimize unilateral military action or coercion without explicit Security Council authorization under Chapter 7. Invoking humanitarian rhetoric to justify force in a deliberate abuse of international law. The Security Council, its members, and the Secretary General bear a clear legal, moral, and political responsibility to unequivocally reject and condemn such unlawful actions before it is too late. The credibility of the United Nations and the survival of the Charter itself now depend on whether this fundamental prohibition is upheld or eroded by one of its own permanent members. Mr. President, Iran seeks neither escalation nor confrontation. However, any act of aggression, direct or indirect, will be met with a decisive, proportionate, and lawful response under Article 51 of the Charter. This is not a threat. It is a statement of legal reality. Responsibility for all consequences will rest solely with those who initiate such unlawful acts. Mr. President, the government of the Islamic Republic of Iran remains fully committed to its human rights obligations, including the right to peaceful protest. It has exercised maximum restraint while fulfilling its duty to protect its people and preserve public order. However, the incitement to violence, encouragement of internal destabilization, and explicit threat of military action against a sovereign member states constitute a threat to international peace and security within the meaning of Article 39 of the Charter. In conclusion, Mr. President, we categorically reject all politically motivated accusations made today against my government. The facts on the ground contradict the fabricated narratives presented by the United States regime and its allies at this meeting. U.S. fabrications of the senseless killing of protesters neither reflects reality on the ground nor would it whitewash Americans' crimes against the great people of Iran. The allegation that the government of the Islamic of Iran has killed peaceful protesters is quite distortion of the facts on the ground. What the Iranian security forces did confront firmly and responsibly were armed ISIS-style terrorist cells and violent separatist groups funded and armed by a few foreign entities, including the Israeli regime. These groups deliberately targeted civilians and law enforcement officers in an attempt to ignite civil war and create the conditions for foreign intervention. The claim that internet restrictions were imposed to conceal harm to our own people is equally false. On the contrary, temporary limitations were necessary to protect Iranian nation from evil operations that foreign agents, including Israeli one, are conducting against the safety of the nation. It was also absolutely vital to prevent huge cyber attacks against Iran and its infrastructure and to disrupt communications among terrorist networks coordinating terror operations from within our cities. I thank you, Mr. President.